Hi, my name is Amanda Sears. I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky, and today I'll be talking about backyard fruit. Today, I'm going to focus on the basics of what it takes to grow fruit and requirements to succeed. I'm going to talk about some of the different fruits that are commonly grown here in Kentucky, and then at the end, I have a list of where you can find plants locally. First thing I want to say though is there are some fruits that are very difficult to grow here in Kentucky, and that would be apples, peaches, and grapes. They grow, but they have a lot of disease and insect problems because of our climate. So I'm going to talk later about some that grow better, but these are considered ones that would be difficult to grow with minimal pesticides. Fruit takes planning. This isn't like growing a vegetable garden where, if you try a plant and it doesn't work, it's an annual and you can take it out and put something back in the next year. These are perennials, and so these will hopefully be there for several years. So preparation is very important, and you want to get the soil ready and as weed-free as possible. For the most part, we tend to start pruning and fertilizing, usually maybe at the end of February or March. And I thought that was one reason this would be such a good time of year to kind of focus on this talk. The exception to that would be strawberries, and those would be fertilized after they bear fruit, so June or July. And irrigation is very important for the next year's crop. I think sometimes after we harvest all our fruit, like the blackberries to the right, it's very easy to kind of forget about them. But that period after they bore fruit is very important in the life cycle of the fruit, because that is when they're putting on their flower buds and getting ready for the next year, or getting ready to put on and create flower buds for the next year. So the maintenance continues even after they have fruited. Location is very important. You want to have good air drainage and soil drainage. You can see from the picture on the right, which I know it looks very official. Cold air does flow down a hill. I don't know if you've ever walked down a hill, but it gets colder as you go down. And because a lot of these plants are not tolerant of frost, or at least their blooms aren't tolerant of frost, you want to put fruit more on the top of a hill or at the top of a slope, so that the cold air will drain away from them. Most will need at least 6 hours of sunlight. And for things like blueberries, it's going to be really important to check soil pH. I'll talk about that later. When you're picking the variety that you want, choose varieties that do well here in Kentucky. At the end of this presentation, I have a link to the publication, Recommended Fruits Varieties for Kentucky. And when you look at that, next to some names, there will be an M and a P, and that stands for minimal pesticide. And those are ones that, although they may still require some spraying and maintenance in that way, they require much less than, say, the grapes or the apples that I mentioned earlier. For instance, strawberries in general are minimal pesticide fruit. So another thing to think about is, does this plant require cross-pollination? Does this plant, so some tree fruits do, and blueberries. Strawberries, grapes, blackberries, and raspberries do not. I also have a link to the disease and pest management guides, and those are found at the back of this presentation as well. I think we used to call this maybe the spray guides, but I feel like they're much more in depth now and talk a lot about cultural practices that are important, things like pruning and removing weak canes and watering, and how to do fertilization better. And so it'll talk about the cultural practice, what time of year to do that, the diseases that may pop up, and then insect problems that may occur, and then also fungicides and insecticides that are that may be required. And it does also talk about which ones are organic as well. And blueberries, actually, this is the shortest one. When you look at the guides for like apples or peaches or grapes, it's much longer. One important thing to do at the end of the season, even if you don't want to look at those disease management guides, is clean up all of the debris. Diseases stay on old debris from the year before. So, for example, that dried up fruit on the right is called a mummy, and mummies think of them as a raisin. Basically, they're dried up fruit, but they oftentimes might harbor some diseases. And if they stay on the tree or on the ground, they can reinfect the tree next year. So on things like blackberries, remove the canes after pruning from the area in case they also are containing any diseases and any fallen leaves. And that's really a good thing to do if you have diseases or suspect any diseases on fruit or even ornamentals. I'm going to start with strawberries. And strawberries are kind of unique, and I just wanted to go over a little bit of nomenclature with you. You've got your top part, your leafy part of the strawberry plant. You have a crown, which is where the roots and the leafy part meet, and you have the roots. And then strawberries actually put off what we call daughter plants, which are basically baby plants that the mother plant is creating and putting out from her. And they're all connected by a stolon. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth with any of the fruit I'm going to talk about, but I wanted to touch on some things that might make it more clear when you're researching or when you're looking in catalogs at fruit. And one thing I think is very important is to know that there are June-bearing strawberries and there are ever-bearing strawberries. June-bearing is what I normally think of, and I think most people grow in their garden, and that ripens in late May. When you plant them the first year, you need to pick off the flowers because removing the flowers will put more energy into the plant and have better root system. Everbears produce fruit over a longer span. So when you plant them in the spring, they will probably produce fruit, I think maybe a little bit over 5 months. Even though it's a longer span, it actually does not have as much fruit as the June bears, but the June bears come all at once. And with everbears, you want to pick off the flowers until the end of June. If you wanted to use strawberries maybe in a pot or maybe in landscaping, everbears would be a better choice. One big thing about strawberries is people tend to put out a whole lot of them, but before they do, they don't control the weeds in the area properly. And that becomes a definite issue as these mother plants are putting off the daughters and they start to compete with grassy weeds or other broadleaf weeds. And so it'd be much better to plant less strawberries, maybe in a bed, than to have a huge amount and have them weedy. The first flowers to bloom on the plants actually produce the largest flowers, but they're the most likely to get frost damage, which is kind of ironic. So I have strawberries here at my own home, and so I always have to kind of already have a plan in place for when we're starting to get those last frosts of the season to cover those strawberries. You can see at the top picture at the right, those strawberry flowers, and the one has a black center, and that shows that that one was killed by a frost. After the harvest, which would be, like I said, June or July, you can go ahead and thin the plants out by about half, and then fertilize at that time. You also, as December comes on and temperatures start to dip into the 20s, you want to cover them with straw. You don't want them to be so covered that you can't see the leaves, but you want to cover them adequately because this will help insulate them for the winter. And then you want to uncover them in March as they start to green up. And a lot of times people will ask, well, you have to use straw, could you use like leaves and things? The only reason I think leaves maybe as a whole leaf wouldn't work is because they might map together and cause water issues, whereas the straw is a little bit, well, it is more narrow and water might flow through a little better. So next I'm going to talk about brambles, and brambles are blackberries and raspberries. It's just the general name for them. And I think it occurred to me one day a few years ago, I don't really know, I mean, I know the difference of what a blackberry and a raspberry is, but technically what is the difference? So when you look at a blackberry and a raspberry, the blackberry has a solid white core. You can see that in the picture, and a raspberry has a hollow core, so it actually pops off the plant differently. Brambles are unique in that, and this gets a little confusing, but If you imagine a plant, the canes that grow that first year are called primal canes. When they become 2 years old, they become a floricane. And at that point, they can bear fruit, and then they die. So you have primocanes, then a floricane, and then they die. And then you cut them out. And when you're pruning, you're basically removing the canes that have already bore fruit. And so it's pretty obvious when you're going in and taking those out, which ones have done that. And I don't want to get bogged down in words, but as you're looking through catalogs, there are some that bear fruit on primocanes. I didn't want to go down that path too much because it's a little bit confusing, but so just remember, canes grow the first year and they don't bear fruit. The second year they bear fruit, and after that we prune. And there are tons of different things to consider when you're wanting to buy and grow brambles. There are thorny and there are thornless. There's different colors, especially in the raspberries. There's, does this type of bramble need a trellis? The type of blackberry I have needs a 6-foot trellis because it trails. Some need a 2-foot trellis. And then, like I mentioned, there are some newer varieties that are actually bearing fruit on primocanes. And if you have those, they are pruned differently. And so it's something else to consider. Blueberries are another plant that actually is considered minimal pesticide for our area. The biggest thing about blueberries is I think our pH of our soil tends to be too high here. Plants grow within an optimal range pH, and our pHs tend to be maybe around 7, 6.5 to 7. The pH of blueberries is about 4.5 to 5.2. So sometimes soils can be fixed. They can be acidified. However, that's not always the case, and it can be difficult. And so I would recommend doing a soil test, or if you really, really want to grow blueberries, but your soil just isn't right, consider a raised bed, and that way it is a little bit easier to manage. With blueberries, they have kind of very unique roots that they don't have root hairs. If you've ever pulled up a tomato plant and looked at the roots, you'll notice fine little roots off the main roots. Blueberries don't have that. And so one thing I always like to tell people is when you're fertilizing, apply that fertilizer completely around the bush. If you only fertilize on one side, the plant will only take it up on that side. When you're planting them, mix a gallon of wet peat moss with the soil in the bottom of the hole. And I don't recommend that with any other plant. Usually I recommend always just using the soil that you took out of the hole to put back in the hole. So another unique thing about blueberries, also blueberry plants get pretty big. They get, I'm about 5 feet tall, and they get as tall as me, if not taller. And so you want to at least give them 6 feet. And then there are some varieties that are smaller, but just something to keep in mind. And when you're pruning blueberries, you want to you don't really need to start major pruning until the plant gets to be about 6 years old. And at that point, you're going to start removing stems that are the oldest. And you're going to focus on keeping the stems that remain young. Grapes are one of the fruits that I mentioned that have some difficulty here. I would say if you're planting these, to make sure and give them plenty of space. One issue I think we have is that we are so humid and wet that they tend to have a lot of disease problems. So make sure and give them plenty of space. Grapes do need a trellis, but that's not something you necessarily have to worry about the first year. So you could go ahead and plant them and then put the trellis in after. Grapes come from buds that are left on 1-year-old canes, and that's a picture of a bud from a cane there on the right. And something else to keep in mind, when you're pruning, you're going to actually cut out about 80 to 90% of the wood that is in a grapevine. And I mean, you will absolutely, to do it right, you have to absolutely take off so much that you think that you have absolutely killed it. And so grape pruning is a little confusing to me. for at backyard versus how they might do it at a vineyard. And because you're removing so much, you're always afraid you're doing it wrong. So I have a couple really good guides at the end of this presentation about pruning, and then also some information about if you're growing grapes on an arbor. I'm gonna talk now about fruit trees, and I'm gonna lump them pretty much all together, although that's probably not fair to fruit trees. But for the sake of brevity, remember peaches and apples especially are very difficult to grow. There are some like Asian pears that would do better here, but do your research. Know which ones do well here. Look at those variety guides. Look at those spray guides to see if you're comfortable with what's recommended. Choose trees with disease resistance, and that does not mean they're GMO. It means that it's been bred or grafted onto them. And I would recommend using a nursery that grew the trees. And that's not to negate how good nurseries we have here, but I just feel like if the nursery has grown the tree itself and a problem pops up, you can always call them and they will talk to you about what to do. And on the front end, you can tell them, I live in Kentucky, my soil is clay, my pH is this, and I want this. What do you recommend? And they'll say, they can tell you what they might recommend, and also what you might need as a second tree if it needs a pollinator. And also be ready for your fruit to not look like what you would buy in the store. So, but it's still going to taste really great, and it's going to be even better because you grew it. I've mentioned pollination a few times. I think most, if not all, fruit trees, I could be wrong, do require cross-pollination. Blueberries do too. Now, with things like blueberries, if you only have one tree, you will still have berries, but you won't have as many. You'll have more if you can get cross-pollination. And again, I think it's important to ask a nursery what they would recommend. The table or diagram on the right shows which trees are pollinating other trees. And a lot of times it boils down to what is blooming at the same time or within a time frame. I mentioned grafting a second ago, and most fruit trees will be grafted. And grafting, if you're not aware, that could be a whole class and has been a whole class on its own. So I did put more information on that at the end. But it's basically taking the rootstock of a tree, of one, let's say, apple tree, and it has characteristics that we like a height and maybe some disease resistance. And we're taking a branch from another tree that we like, and we're basically putting them together. And so we're putting rootstock and sign together, and it's making one tree. And that tree will have the characteristics of that rootstock and the characteristics of that top wood. And you can see from the bottom picture, there'll be kind of a funny looking part at the bottom, kind of a scarred area. Again, it's a very interesting, grafting is very interesting. I would recommend reading the publication on the end about that. So if you're thinking about what size tree to get, standard, you know how big a standard size tree is. When you're using rootstock to think about what size tree, you probably don't want a standard size tree. You probably want something that is small enough that if you needed to spray it, you could. If you needed to, or when you prune, it's not getting out a huge ladder. You can pick all the fruit off of it. So again, the rootstock that is chosen to go with that tree kind of denotes how large the tree will be. I do recommend semi-dwarf, not standard, but a semi-dwarf, and probably not a true dwarf. At least the true dwarfs I've read about, I think, have to have a lot of staking and may not be as stable as one. So there are, within semi-dwarf, there is a lot of different varieties. And again, this is a lot of information, and we can talk about this, please call me, we can talk more. But this is one reason I think it's important to talk to a nursery to see what they would recommend work for you. Now, talking about pruning, and I mentioned in the beginning that late winter or early spring is the best time to prune pretty much all fruit. So with trees especially, what do you focus on? And you don't want to take out more than 20% of the tree at the time, because that will lead to some stress. And so kind of get an idea of what is the biggest problems. Start there. If after that you have not reached what you think would be about 20%, you can go on to the next. But some of the I start out by looking for crowded limbs or anything that's kind of rubbing other branches, and I take that out. Anything that is growing straight up or straight down, I remove. If you have a weak crotch angle, which means a branch that is less than 45 degrees from the main branch, you don't have to take it out. I would either, if you can remove it and the tree be okay and look okay and be even, take it out. But if you can't, maybe get a stick or, and you can actually order these from catalogs, but a piece of plastic that you can bend the limb down and it will train the limb to grow at a different angle. Water sprouts are also something, they're those branches that grow straight up. You can see that number 3 in that picture. Anything that's diseased or injured, take out, and that won't count towards your 20%. And then also anything that's coming straight up from the root, like that number 4. That number 4 is coming up from the root or the root stock. It is actually not technically the same tree as the one that you actually are pruning. So remove those. And just a note, one reason Bradford pears fail as trees is because they have weak crotch angles. And what happens is then we get a lot of rain and wind, and those weak crotch angles break. And so that is why we don't recommend those trees. Thinning, I think of this especially with apples and peaches. A lot of times they put on maybe a lot more fruit than they can really take to harvest. And so just to think about it, you need 40 to 50 leaves for an apple to go to maturity. The same with a peach. So a lot of apples especially will thin themselves a bit. And so if you ever see an apple tree drop a bunch of fruit in June, that is normal. It's just removing some of the fruit that it didn't need. But what I would do is I would break up clusters. So if you have a cluster of maybe 6 little peaches, I would remove all but one and pick whichever one you think looks the strongest and remove all the other ones. Pull off any damaged fruit and just kind of try to get it to look uniform. And in general, don't shake the tree to encourage thinning because you will end up shaking off more than you meant to. Just quick note on some lesser known fruits, and these all grow well here in Kentucky. They're just ones that we don't talk about a whole lot and they maybe aren't as well known, but a fig, and those are getting really popular. And I actually have a Chicago hardy fig here. It dies back to the ground every year and then comes back. I get maybe 20 figs a year, but it's very fun, kind of neat plant to watch. Currants and gooseberries. I tried to grow gooseberry once and it didn't work, but they are good plants. Elderberry, aronia, pawpaw, which is native, mulberries, which are native, and service berries, which are also native. And the mulberry you can see is a picture there on the bottom right, and aronia is on the top. And I don't always think of landscaping with fruit, but I was just kind of thinking about what might be of interest and topic today. And it's kind of a natural fit because a lot of fruit plants are very pretty. You can see in the picture on the right, there's a grape arbor. And so there's other plants that also have climbing sort of growth, like blackberries. Shrubs, I put blueberry there, but gooseberries, currants are also shrubs you could use. And then ground covers as a strawberry. We are fortunate here in Madison County that we actually do have some local plant producers. Garver Farms in Paint Lick grows several different types of plants. I bought blackberries from Shane before. I have bought from Shane before, and they were very good plants. So if you want to Google Garver Farms, he has a Facebook page. England's Nursery and Orchard in McKee. They actually specialize in Asian fruit, which is very interesting, very neat website. And he also has a lot of nut trees. Peaceful Heritage Nursery, I have not talked to them a lot, but they are in Stanford, and I believe they set up at the farmers market in Berea, I think. Some other plant sources that are not local, but I've been told by administration is good ones to order from: Indiana Berry and Plant, Adams County Nursery, and Stark Brothers. There are a lot of other places you can order from that do equally well. These are just a few that I've put together. So that's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please call me or email me. I meant to do this class via Zoom live, but we're in the middle of an ice storm and my Zoom did not work. So I apologize for that. So if there are questions, maybe we can have a question and answer class later. But I always welcome your questions, and you all are usually really great, and I really have to thank. So thank you all. I also will send the PDF later of the presentation. Thank you.